Hello and welcome to Can Trustworthy AI Help De-Risk Adoption of AI? I'm your host, Pamela Gupta, and as you know, for the last 5 years, I've been focused on how to identify risks that can come from AI and de-risk them, especially when it comes to trustworthiness in AI. Trustworthy elements of 8 essential pillars that I defined also 5 years ago include those of security, privacy, audit, transparency, explainability, regulations, bias, and accountability. In this particular episode, I'm really excited to be talking about a phenomena that has been a top of mind for a lot of companies that are adopting AI, which is generative AI. We're going to be talking about trustworthiness in generative AI and LLMs with a leading authority on the subject. Very happy to welcome Krishnaram Kenthapadi. Krishnaram is Chief AI Officer and Chief Scientist at Fiddler AI, where he's leading initiatives on generative AI and on AI safety and trustworthiness. The quick background on his, where what led to where he is. He received his PhD in computer science from Stanford University. Led to researcher at Microsoft Research Silicon Valley, and represented LinkedIn in Microsoft's AI Ethics Advisory Board, which led to principal scientist at Amazon, where he led responsible AI initiatives in AWS ML, and also shaped the initiative on SageMaker Clarify from inception to launch. So, really excited to have you here, Krishnaram. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Pamela, for the kind introduction, and thank you to all the listeners of this podcast.
So, did I miss anything in your background or your area of focus?
No, I think that was great.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's talk about, when you have led initiatives around trustworthiness, around safety, and as you know, there's a lot of focus on building safe and secure, trustworthy AI coming from the executive order, for instance. I'd like to start out with what is your view and definition of trustworthiness?
Sure. I would like to go back to some of the things you touched upon towards the beginning. So, to me, trustworthiness in AI or machine learning means that the models or the applications not only work as a whole in terms of precision, recall, or other quality measures, but they also work for all different subgroups. This is what we often refer to as bias and fairness. They also respect the privacy of individuals, whether it is the privacy of individuals whose training data has been used, or it could be privacy of those who may be querying the model, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
It also means that these models are interpretable or explainable. We know how the decision has been arrived at. A domain expert leveraging an AI system should be able to decide when they can trust the system and when they should not, and instead use their own judgment. And we can go on other dimensions like robustness is making sure that the model is not brittle. It behaves in the same way even if there are minor perturbations in the input to the model, uh, and the model or the application continues to behave as it was behaving before. And there are several different dimensions, and trustworthiness is not just a technical aspect, there is a social aspect as well. uh, Often I emphasize that we need to think about trustworthiness in AI and machine learning, not only taking inputs from technologists like me, but also people with other backgrounds, whether it is social science or legal, product, or even the customers or the users who may be benefiting or be impacted by the AI applications themselves.
Yeah, that's true. That's a great point. Now, when you're talking about trustworthiness, then are you? Is there a difference in the trustworthiness challenge from predictive AI to generative AI or LLMs?
So I think many of the concerns we have seen over the last few years for predictive ML systems carry over to large language models and other generative AI systems. Aspects like bias or leakage of private information or explainability and other dimensions or robustness. But there are a few aspects which are a little bit unique or kind of more pertinent in the case of generative AI systems. Talking to several customers, one of the things that we often hear is there is a desire not only to evaluate such models or systems for trustworthiness, but also to have an AI safety or AI firewall layer wherein once the model is deployed, the customers are interested in detecting any uh, undesirable outputs. For example, outputs which may be toxic or which may be considered as biased, or the outputs which might contain personally identifiable information and so forth. And if such outputs are detected, they expect the AI safety layer uh, to stop those outputs from being shown to the end user and instead defer to maybe a domain expert. This could be a customer support representative, this could be maybe a doctor or somebody else. So I think that is one difference we see yeah, at a high level between predictive ML and generative AI models. There are also other differences in terms of, in the case of predictive ML, the output of the model is often a classification. It could be a binary classification or it could be regression and so forth. But in the case of generative AI models, often the output is free form or unstructured. Output could be text, it could be images, it could be voice, code, or combinations of this. As a result, even articulating what we mean by biased, what we mean by correctness, or is the model making up things, as in what is often called as hallucinations. These have become emerging concerns that we have not witnessed with predictive ML or arising in the case of large language models and other generative AI models.
That's interesting, right? Definitely, the you know, I often think about, we are talking about, we know what the risks are, right? When it comes to hallucinations, those may or may not be able to be ever be removed, right? So where do we go from here? And that's really my next question, and in terms of the impact and adoption for businesses. So this, when we are talking about generative AI and we talk about trustworthiness or predictiveness or reliability, you mentioned toxicity, right? Those are things that really doesn't even come into any of those categories, right? Any of those pillars that I talked about when it comes to um, maybe attractability or appropriateness, right,
Mhm.
for a context, for example, right? Is it appropriate for um, a given context, such as customer care, client center, whatever the use case may be for that? Where, how are companies, what do you feel is going to be a sustainable and a standardized, scalable way to address this from a business impact perspective?
Sure. So, as you kind of alluded to, some of these challenges seem quite hard, and we may not ever get to a place where we have fully solved these issues like hallucinations. So I think often a good starting point is the application setting in which these models are going to be used. Uh, for example, whether the application is end user facing or whether it's just internal facing make itself makes a big difference. The tolerance for some of these issues might be a little bit relaxed if the applications are internal facing. The next aspect is, once we have decided what is the application setting, we need to narrow down the key concerns, whether the key concerns are around, say, aspects like toxicity or bias or PAI leakage, or the other dimensions like transparency or explainability, the robustness, and so forth. And then we need to think through these concerns uh, throughout the entire life cycle of the generative AI application, meaning starting from when we are designing how we are putting together the application. Are we leveraging APIs from external providers like OpenAI or Anthropic or others? Or are we leveraging open source models like Llama 2 and others? Or is even though these providers may have done rigorous testing for the model or the API as a whole, is that sufficient in the specific setting that we are deploying in? Uh, if, for instance, if a health insurance company wants to deploy a chatbot leveraging OpenAI's LLMs, it may, there may still be a need to evaluate in the context of the health insurance setting. There may be a desirability to evaluate with respect to, say, typical prompts that that may be encountered in customer service setting for the health insurance. How robust is the application for that setting? How accurate are the responses? Are the responses aligned with the company values? Is the LLM response accidentally promoting a competitor or saying things which may put the company in a bad light? Or is there toxicity or is there bias in the output of the LLMs with respect to these queries, the queries of interest for this particular domain, and so forth? So these are some examples of the things that one would want to evaluate before deploying the model. And likewise, even after the model is deployed, presumably after a thorough evaluation, and we have done vetting and red teaming and so forth, it's still desirable to continue to monitor the application, because we may not fully expect what are the kinds of prompts that people might issue. Can we assume that all the prompts will be benign? Could somebody be
Right.
intentionally trying to get the system to behave in a way that it was intended for? Or even something as simple as, or is the distribution of the prompts once deployed very different from the distribution that was seen during evaluation or training time? In those cases, we have a good reason to think that the application may not be behaving as intended. And so that is the reason it's desirable to have monitoring or observability mechanisms as well, in addition to the evaluation before deployment. And all of this is in a feedback loop. Once we identify some issues, then we may need a way to identify the root causes and take the appropriate remedy, whether it is in terms of perhaps maybe fine tuning the LLM, or is it in terms of maybe using it in an augmented setting, like retrieval augmented setting. Do we need to uh, measure how well that combined system is working, like how good is the quality of the retrieved documents in the case of retrieval augmentation? Or is the natural language response from the LLM faithful to the content of the retrieved documents, and so forth? So there are a number of such dimensions that we would need to consider across the entire life cycle of the application.
So, two points related to that on observations. So, one is the risk and the what that can be identified, anticipated, right? Because that's what I do, right? I help identify what can go wrong and how to anticipate and put in the measures. So let's say in one case for customer care, you don't have a chatbot that is NLP, or I mean generative AI based, and is directly interfacing with customer, but there is a human involved in that, and it can still be scalable, it can still be profitable for the business, but it doesn't have to be a risk that what is being produced is not within that risk appetite or the culture alignment for Because, as you mentioned, the way I'm hearing it also, from what I know and from what you're telling me, reiterating that not even if it is tested, even if it is tested by the model provider, it's
Mhm.
tested by the model implementer.
Mhm.
Because, however, it is generative AI and it is generating new content, you can't always predict that it will be within the realm of what is acceptable. So, so in any case, it's not something that can be autonomous. In other words, you know.
And also to some extent that depends on the risk appetite or acceptability for the application setting. And even if we have taken all the strictest measures for vetting, it's still possible that the application might misbehave from time to time, and that is the reason to leverage any potential feedback. For example, if we deploy in a chatbot setting, we could even have feedback as simple as thumbs up or thumbs down, and then we can try to figure out what is the space of the negative feedback. Is the negative feedback concentrated in certain regions wherein the model is not having good performance? For example, one of the things that we have recently explored is how to leverage some embeddings of the prompts and responses. By embeddings, we refer to mapping the prompts and responses to high dimensional vectors in Euclidean space, and then looking at clusters of these embeddings. It's possible that if all the negative feedback is coming from a few clusters and
Mm.
those clusters were not observed during training or evaluation of the model, it's quite possible that the model may not know how to respond well to those kind of new types of queries. And these are the kinds of things wherein, even if things may not be perfect, we can leverage the feedback, leverage where the model may not be working well, to figure out what needs to be done to further improve the model.
So, so what I'm hearing is don't throw surprises. You know, kind of chart out what are acceptable patterns in of usage, and then test that out fully. So that will at least be indicative of the kind of realm that you may be getting responses in, even if
Kind
it's not 100%.
Yes, I'll give a couple of examples to kind of illustrate some of the challenges. If you think of the unknowns, right, we can kind of maybe group them into maybe known unknowns or unknown unknowns. I- In the case of, say, LLMs or other generative AI models, if we even consider a dimension like bias and fairness, we can potentially measure the model with respect to well-known dimensions like maybe gender or age, skin tone, race, and so forth. But it's possible that in spite of doing such measurements with respect to known dimensions, there may be some subtle biases which we may not know beforehand. To give a specific example, uh, when Bing launched its AI chatbot roughly around this time last year, they did not anticipate the kinds of interactions that it would have with the New York Times journalist. So that's the kind of space I'm referring to as kind of the unknown unknowns, right? But that doesn't mean that we should kind of be fully be afraid and never even try these models out, because it's not possible, or it may not be feasible realistically to anticipate all those kinds of issues beforehand. Uh, so long as we have this mindset of like one improving the model once we identify those issues, and kind of figuring out how to kind of preempt such issues from recurring in the future, I think that could be a mindset. And this is some a mindset I'm seeing play out in many settings where the companies are attempting to deploy the models slowly and iterate very fast once some issues are observed. instead of uh, taking a very very conservative stance and never deploying the application in the first place. Part of the challenge is that it's not as though we can not we can kind of just think through and identify all the issues and deploy a perfect model, because we don't have full knowledge of how users may interact with the model beforehand. And often that's kind of humbling, and it's also surprising, because we cannot fully know how the different ways, sometimes creative ways, in which people might leverage AI systems or other models and applications.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and also it's if we look at it, we stand to draw a line between those who think there is no risk and they are going ahead, and those who think that there's too much risk and then you don't want to deploy it, right?
Right.
So it does warrant a more curated and a more risk aware approach, so one can make the right decisions, right?
Yes, I think that that's spot on. In fact, if you look at some of the regulatory efforts coming out of European Union, they also think in terms of the risk spectrum, right? The level of risk that we might want to take when it comes to a recommender system or showing an ad is very different from the level of risk that we would be comfortable with, say, a mission critical system like driving an airplane, right? So kind of I think that needs to be factored in cases where there is a greater risk appetite. The iterative approach I was alluding to earlier might work fine, but in cases where the it's mission critical, the stakes are very high, then that approach does not quite work. And in fact, in this context, let me kind of show this really fascinating book that I'm reading. So this is the book The Coming Wave by Google DeepMind co-founder Mustafa Sulaiman, wherein he kind of draws this fine line between the two extremes you are alluding to, where people saying that let's kind of accelerate AI at any cost, and the other extreme where people are very nervous about AI leading to existential risk and so forth, and there is a lot of spectrum in between. And in 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 either of these extremes, it's easy to lose track of all the benefits that can come out of AI, not only for the parts of the world where everybody is online and AI is benefiting further from that, and it's also we should also think of the potential benefit of AI in especially in underserved communities across the world. There is a huge potential upside, and at the same time, we should not ignore all the downsides as well, whether known downsides like the bias or uh,
Right. Right.
toxicity and other issues, and also potential newer issues that are going to arrive in the near future, like disruptions to the labor market or misinformation and several other even potential effects on democratic institutions. These are all also dimensions that we need to start thinking deeply right now.
Yes, yes, I totally agree with that. I do. I like the approach EU AI Act has taken on that, which is a risk based assessment of deployment. And, one thing I want to get your thoughts on is how much of um, the onus of the final accountability, right? That's something that goes to that trustworthiness of implementation of AI. Who does um, who does it belong to? So, for example, if you're using as a business, you're using a model that has been created by one of the big model providers, right? Something goes wrong. Is that a something you can go to one of these model providers for and say, well, um, how did this happen? This has resulted in so much downtime or business loss, etc. I mean, whose door is going to be knocked on, right? Who do you hold accountable? The
So I
end user is one thing, right? They will come to the business. You're the front, you're the face, right? So they're going to come to you. But if something does misfire, and there is a uh, something that is not anticipated, for example, so we're approaching red teaming. Talking about red teaming and talking about kicking the tires, and we are not even talking about how are we building this thing, but we're going to kick the tires and we're going to see if this does not falter when it's functioning. And I see a flaw in that. So there's tongue-in-cheek kind of a reference there, because I don't think red teaming by itself is sufficient for finding what can go wrong, and what we need to do is, and when we do it. But keeping that aside, if something has been tested, can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, where does
yeah.
it go?
First of all, this is a fantastic question. I don't claim to know the perfect answer or even to have the right expertise to respond, but I can still share some thoughts that from what I have seen recently. I think first of all, it it can start with the application itself, like the company that's deploying say LLMs or other generative AI models, and in what context they're deploying it in, and what is acceptable for that context, and what are the regulatory requirements if there are any, and so forth. In terms of where the responsibility lies when something goes wrong, I think that can happen at different levels. Recently, for instance, we are starting to see some of the large providers like Microsoft, Google, and others uh, indemnifying against copyright violations.
Copyright, yeah, right.
Right? I think that's a trend that we will see more and more, because uh, otherwise, like, the customers will be concerned or may not want to make use of these models because of the potential copyright or other implications. Um, the, the other dimension is around whether self-regulation or the existing incentives at a corporate level are sufficient. It may, in some cases it may be, if the business interests of the organization or the reputational concerns or reputational potential reputational damage of things going wrong is has enough influence, but often it may not be, and that's the setting where the regulations like the ones being adopted in European Union or US or other countries play a big role. And more broadly, I would think frame this in terms of incentives. At the level of a company or at the level of a society, we need such incentives in the form of maybe regulations or other actions. At the level of a specific organization itself, there need to be incentives at the different levels. For instance, the teams need to be incentivized not only for maybe improving business metrics, but also for identifying bias or toxicity or other AI safety issues. Yeah, even at an individual level, yes, data scientist or a machine learning practitioner need to be as incentivized to detect these issues as they are incentivized today for improving maybe click-through rate or conversion or other business metrics. I think that's very important. Without having these incentives at all different levels, it's hard to expect that the trustworthy AI will get automatically deployed or adopted at all these different levels.
So, can you think of some incentives for a data scientist for trustworthiness?
So I think
By design.
often one of the things that I see, especially attending some of the research conferences, is that uh, many data scientists are passionate about doing the right thing in terms of identifying biases or other issues and so forth. They're kind of they are doing this not because of any external incentives, but because they're passionate about this topic and they believe that this is there is a huge responsibility in terms of what they're doing for this. But I think on a more practical setting, the in addition to maybe CEOs or other leaders uh, emphasizing that responsible AI or trustworthiness is important, they also need to make sure that that message is percolated within the organization, and that has to be in the form of how the scientists are rewarded. If it turns out that the scientists are rewarded a lot for improving business metrics, but they're not incentivized or rewarded as much for detecting and preventing the reputational damage or even legal damage from happening, then there is a disconnect. Then the system will kind of gear them towards just improving business metrics at any cost.
I think that's a really great answer, Krishnaram, because it's not a question of just monetary, incentives. It has to be organizational. I mean, that is what, again, that's how we work, right? We create centers of excellence where you can't just hold the data scientists responsible and make them accountable for the system they created. It has to, that's obviously not directly tied into their job function, but we want to make it easier, and we don't want to make them accountable, but be a part of that, how to deliver on that, right?
And
That's the way I say it.
I think part of this is also about creating awareness, right? A few
Right.
years back, issues like bias and fairness, or even privacy in machine learning, was not as known. And one of the things that I saw or I thought would help towards this was to kind of create awareness. And this is the reason that I really enjoyed presenting tutorials at various research conferences or giving industry talks. uh, I think that has to start. Like, the educational awareness is a first step, so that companies or scientists or the teams even know that these are issues to think about. And then once there is awareness, and then the aspect of incentives or the right alignment comes into the picture.
Yeah, and the only reason I mentioned the accountability component is because I was at one of these conferences and talking to a data scientist who leads it for a large beverage company, and he said, "Well, management typically comes to us and says, well, do we have ethical AI, right? And how can you prove that, and how can you show that?" But in my opinion, that's not the right question for them, right? The right question is, what are we doing in the organization to create that awareness, and how does, because after all, it's not just going to be the data scientist who's involved in delivering on that product and process, right? So what exists within the company, to facilitate the right conversation and the right risk appetite. So
Yes, I think that's very true. In fact, often, if many of these dimensions need to be thought of as a process, not just as a technological dimension, right? Like, if you think of, say, fairness, for instance, we need to start with, have we gotten inputs from all the relevant stakeholders, including those who may be impacted or affected by the system? Then, having done that, have we created the right team in term which has, yeah, different perspectives in terms of diversity, in terms of demographics or lived experiences, and so on and so forth. Then, after that, we get to some of the technical aspects. Have we collected data that is representative of all different dimensions of interest? Have we incorporated bias or fairness constraints as part of training the model or tuning the model? And once we deploy, have do we monitor not only for the quality or performance, but also for bias or other issues, right? And then, kind of, the entire feedback cycle of what do we do when we detect some of these issues. Under what conditions will we decide to roll back the model? And what is an acceptable trade-off between, say, bias and quality, in case there is such a trade-off, right? And these are all decisions that we need to think through and make beforehand, so that we are in a position where we don't have to react in an emergency like situation, right? Or we don't know how to react, how to handle a completely unexpected situation.
Yes, I agree, and I think this is a great conclusion to, the podcast, because the objective is really, how do you move forward, right? How do you adopt AI and not put yourself in more risk, but instead of going into it with open eyes, what the risks are, and how do you de-risk with adopting the right approach and principles. So if you have any parting comments, happy to hear those. But otherwise, I would like to thank you for really a great conversation.
Yeah, yes, I think to kind of maybe summarize, like it'll be great for all of us to think about trustworthiness by design as opposed to viewing these dimensions as an afterthought. And that is an exercise or endeavor that requires all of us to be involved. And I hope uh, through even this small short episode, the listeners start reflecting more on these dimensions. And thanks, Pamela, for again like inviting me to this podcast.
Yes, thank you so much for a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.